to go on and become the Chief of Staff of the California Democratic Party from 1971 until 1976, and while I went to law school at night. A few years later, I was lucky enough to be elected chairman of the party, a position I held from 1981 to 1989. Why is any of this information relevant, you might ask? First of all, it is important to know that the thousands of us who knew Joe only through Democratic politics thought that was the only life he had. He was so consumed and devoted to the affairs of the party, it seemed inconceivable that he could be doing anything else, such as conducting an amazing career as a lawyer, a community activist, and a husband and a father. You know, it's impossible to tell the story of the Joe Wyatt that I knew without also telling you a little bit about the history of the California Democratic Party in the last half of the 20th century and its sister organization, the California Democratic Council. The California Democratic Party that existed when Joe first came to the game in 1950 or so was unrecognizable from the party that we know today. The legacy of the Southern Pacific Railroad was in full force, and my party was then the red-headed stepchild of California politics. In 1951, out of 162 partisan elected officials in California, less than 50 were Democrats. Democrats of that era, on their best day, were a gnat on the rear of the all-powerful Republican elephant. Let me share with you a brief list of the issues that were being totally ignored by the California electorate of that era. The rights of African Americans, the rights of Mexican Americans, the rights of women, one person, one vote, the right of everyone to participate equally in all of the benefits of American citizenship, particularly in the American South, rights of Asians, and particularly those Japanese Americans imprisoned during World War II by two of the greatest liberals of the 20th century, Franklin Roosevelt and Earl Warren. Gays and lesbians weren't even yet on the radar screen of even the most liberal among us. American foreign policy was all about defending the free world from the Red Menace, and a little place called Vietnam would not show up until a few years later. California was the reddest of the red states in the country. I know from a lifetime in politics that change starts in the little back rooms. Not smoke-filled rooms, but rooms full of committed activists willing to stand up for an idea and who will not be quiet until the needle of public opinion moves. I have seen it, lived it, been there, and done the t-shirt, and have the t-shirt. Joe Wyatt and his good friend, longtime California Senator Alan Cranston, did just that. In 1953, together with a small group of committed activists, Joe and Alan declared war on the status quo in California. They started the greatest grassroots political action group in California history. The founding of the California Democratic Council that year marked the birth of the modern California Democratic Party, a party that demands an equal shot and fair shot at the American dream for all Americans, irrespective of background, race, religion, sex, sexual preference, or ethnicity. Together, Joe and Alan Cranston were California's greatest earthquake. Because of them, this state will never be the same, and we are all better off for what they did. In 1958, 5 years after the founding of the California Democratic Council, California was turned on its head with the elections of Pat Brown as governor, a host of other statewide elected officials, and scores of Democrats in the state legislature and Congress. The fight wasn't over, but it was off to a great beginning. We were a red state in presidential politics until 1992, but without with Joe Wyatt and Alan Cranston started, it never would have happened. I met Joe halfway through his grand journey through state and national politics. By 1970, Alan was in the United States Senate, and Joe had become the unbelievably respected senior counselor to Democratic state chairs and chairs of Democratic delegations to national conventions. He helped scores of us preside over the never quiet or peaceful convocations of Democrats at state and national conventions. A short list of those who he saved from procedural sinkholes included such people as Chuck Manat, Nancy Pelosi, Jess Unruh, Dick O'Neill, John Tunney, Tom Bradley, Jerry Brown, Roz Wyman, Gene Wyman, and a host of others. None of us who ever chaired one of these conventions or delegation meetings will ever forget the comfort of having Joe at our side dispensing rulings on procedural matters which somehow always seemed to come out in favor of whatever the chair needed at the time. His bearing and demeanor were never challenged. As a lawyer, I will never forget his greatest parliamentary skill. If the bylaw or Robert's rules were not favorable to your client, make it up, but do it with a straight face. Two vignettes I have to share. At one particularly contentious Democratic state convention, God knows what was going on the floor. Joe's making some ruling. I'm temporarily standing off to the side. And a delegate from Humboldt County came up to me and said, "No, Pete, it's so great you came up here to campaign, and I just want to hand you one of the finest products from Humboldt County." It was a presidential election year. There must have been 100 cameras in the back of the room. Joe looked over, saw what was happening because he knew the guy, and was laughing his head off as I received a baggie of California's finest marijuana. One other vignette. One of my predecessors as party chair was our now speaker, Nancy Pelosi. And for some long forgotten reason, at some Democratic convention, the activists were upset with Nancy and had introduced a motion to censure her. Joe and I had worked on a signal with the floor, and we arranged with Nancy's daughter, Christine Pelosi, who herself went on to become the chief of staff of the party one day. And the orders to the room were, first of all, Christine, wear a red dress. Our orders to the floor were, when the red dress stands up, vote yes, and when the red dress sits down, vote no. Joe, you were a dear and valued friend. You are and were a part of the history and fabric of this great state where you made your home and raised your family. I will miss you and treasure the times that we spent together. Marge, Daniel, Lynn, Jonathan, Tammy, Jack, and Tara, please accept the prayers and love of my family and me. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Don Feinstein, and I'm a hematologist at USC, and I participated in Joe's medical care for many years before I retired about 5 years ago. I must say that my retirement is similar to Joe's in that I continue to work daily, although with a somewhat different mission and somewhat diminished time. Joe and Marge and my wife Jackie and I have had several dinners together and have enjoyed many conversations regarding the woes of our state and our country and the world and their potential solutions. I must say that I've never tied or worn a hand-tied bow tie in my entire life, but I wanted to wear one today and I borrowed this from a friend on Saturday. I've been working on it for 3 days. I even went to YouTube. How to tie a bow tie by dummies. I obviously failed. Anyway, whenever we do something different, we always become quite inquisitive, and so, as you know, most of us now defer to the internet. So I Googled men who wear bow ties. And they describe those individuals as statement makers, almost in an act of defiance. I thought that was a good description of Joe. Then they listed famous people who frequently wore bow ties. And there were 2 lawyers that were named, Archibald Cox and Joseph Welch. And I thought that Joe would fit pretty well with those 2. Then there were several famous people. Winston Churchill, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Albert Schweitzer, C. Everett Koop. I thought that was a good group too. I left out George Will. Then, interestingly, down at the bottom of the list, I saw a man named Woodrow Wyatt. And those of you who don't know, and I didn't know, he was a British Labour politician and a journalist and broadcaster. And I was wondering whether Joe might be related to this man. So I looked him up, and it told a lot about this particular individual, and said he was a friend of Rupert Murdoch. So I knew he wasn't related to Joe. But it could be a recessive genetic trait. Thus, I concluded from this evidence that Joe was in very good and compatible company, and that that possibly he might have inherited his bow tie wearing, if you will, as a recessive trait, but surely not dominant. As many of you know, Joe used to drive an old bubble Porsche, and I was very envious of that because I've always wanted a Porsche. But my wife, Jackie's never allowed it. The closest that I've ever been to buying a Porsche was when my son totaled Ben and Nan Crocker's Porsche 40 years ago. As most of you know, Joe was unique. Not too many octogenarians work every day through their 8th decade. And he worked right up to the time that he entered the hospital, as was mentioned previously. And I'm a witness to that. In fact, when he became desperately ill and could barely communicate, his first command to me was to inform his secretary that he wouldn't be able to get back to work as planned previously. Even when he could no longer speak because he had a tracheostomy, he was communicating with a big yellow pad and a felt pen. Obviously, he had used this before and put it to good use again, asking questions, giving orders, and exhibiting a great deal of frustration because he couldn't talk. You've already heard that he was not only a world-class lawyer, but a national expert in his field and the author of his huge 10-pound volume Bible on Trust Administration and Taxation that, as Phillips mentioned previously. I didn't know about this before, but I can't help but believe that this must have been exciting reading. law students. I'm glad that he didn't ask me to read it, and if he had, I would have only accepted if he had read one of my hematology journals. His involvement in the community, state, and national activities have already been mentioned, and represents a very long list that are too numerous to mention again, but have been noted by others. However, his major personal interests were more devoted to state and national politics, and locally to childhood education. You might say that he took the right side of the many problems of our times, and what I mean by the word right is not in the political sense, but meaning standing up for what is right for our society as a whole, whether that be gun control, social equality for all, support for public education, or the abrogation of financial influence on our political process. As John Ruskin once said, what we think or what we know or what we believe is in the end of little consequence. The only consequence is what you do. And Joe did a lot, as you've heard before. He was a man of short stature, quick steps, and a quicker mind. You only had to meet Joe once, and you felt that he had known you for years. He had that unique ability that made each person think that they had their own special relationship with him. He had a great sense of humor that was witty, dry, and a bit sarcastic at appropriate times, but always delivered with a sparkle in his eyes. I think that his exemplary life can be best described by a quote from Winston Churchill. We make a living for what we get. We make a life for what we give. And Joe gave a lot. Thank you.
Don, you left your bow tie. Don't feel bad. My wife and I spent an hour trying to get one on me, and it didn't work. Yes, Jack is sporting his, and we'll see it in short order. What to say about my dad? That is a daunting enough proposition, but on the heels of these very accomplished professional people and very articulate speakers, I think I may have set myself up here a little bit, but I'm going to do my best. I stayed awake last night trying to think of words that would do him justice, and I decided that wasn't going to be possible. I rely exclusively on sincerity. He was such a unique person, a unique human being, and the emphasis strongly on the word human. You talk about breaking the mold. There's nobody like him. Don, I was talking to you the other night, and we were chatting on this subject, and you used a phrase that I'm going to steal. I'm glad you didn't use it in your speech. And you said that Dad had unassuming greatness. And I think that's exactly right. He was so content and so secure in himself. I was always so envious of that, because most of us have some sort of insecurities, and he just seemed so content. Rightfully so. He had no sense of or source of bravado. He was not overly proud, but his sense of security was evidenced in how he conducted himself each and every day, with a sense of ease, assuredness, quick wit, and the good humor that Don mentioned. Dad knew what he was about. He was comfortable in his own skin, and as a result, he made us comfortable with him. He was always more interested in the person that he was talking to than he was in what he had to say. And it's always so rare to find someone like that. I wanted to be funny, and tearing up screws that up royally, but But I have something I want to share with you that I found. Part of the, I mean, this is a true silver lining on a dark cloud, but part of the silver lining of this entire episode has been going through all of the wonderful mementos, the pictures that some of you may have seen in the back. You've got to look at the one where Dad was a coal miner. That's fantastic. And yes, he was a coal miner, believe it or not. He did a little of everything. But I found, of all things, a fax transmittal form. And this fax went to Dr. Richard Ware. I think Dr. Ware is here. He was. I'm not sure if he's still here. And Dr. Ware was my dad's general practitioner, general physician, as still he is for my mother and others in our family. And Dad often communicated with Dr. Ware via fax. And I found this fax sheet that I thought was classic Joe Wyatt, so I had to read it to you. And it's not so much the message as it is how he signed the fax, for those of you who sign faxes. So he sent it to Dr. Ware, and the subject was my mother, and she had had some physical issues that had required her to stop drinking her nightly glass of Chardonnay. It had been a tradition over years.